right, hey, welcome to Tabletop Tango. I'm Carl, one of your hosts, and I've got Eric with me. I guess I'd say as
Hello?
always.
It's Tabletop Tango.
Tabletop Tango. Wango Tango. Yeah, that was a hard name to find, so it took us a while to find this name, and
Every single name is taken.
literally there's like no ways to name any podcast anything else now that has anything to do with tabletop gaming. I guess I blame Critical Role for that. But anyway, so welcome to this video, which is where we'll focus on Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, give an introduction to the game, and kind of teach you a little bit about it so that you can enjoy a game that I love personally. I love Savage Worlds. I think it's a great game. Tell you a little bit about it, the mechanics, and sort of how to make it happen. So, Eric, what do you think? What's the best part of Savage Worlds? What's it best for?
Well, first I would say definitely this episode is the very, very basics. If you've never played Savage Worlds before, this is where you want to start. We'll be referencing this video in our other videos where we do deep dives about more individual aspects like character creation and combat. So if you've never played any Savage Worlds at all, this is where you want to start. Otherwise, you can jump to one of our deep dives if you're familiar, you've played a little bit, or you've played an older edition. But yes, getting back to your question, Carl, Savage Worlds is a genre-less game. It is a kind of base mechanics that don't have a specific setting or genre. There's a lot of companion books that you can get with them for specific genres like science fiction or fantasy, but this is meant to be kind of put over any other setting. So settings that people come out with, your own settings. That's one thing about it. The other thing I would say is that ultimately it is a cinematic game. I mean, it's meant to be, their whole thing is like fun, fast, and furious, which it is. Like, it is very fun. It is very fast, very easy to GM. Can be very furious. It can be very lethal and deadly. But also, it's very cinematic.
Well, I think that's a good point you pointed out. As far as a game system goes, it's really good for anything but super high fantasy, I think. You know, where we're talking about, I want to keep chipping away at hit points. It's really good for modern or science fiction or even horror.
Superhero.
Yeah, superhero. Anything that really has where you want to flare the dramatic, I guess, and have some fun doing that. So, and you'll see as we go through the mechanics how the game mechanics make that possible. Speaking of which, we can move right into the game mechanics. And what's the most fundamental thing when we talk about a game? It's dice. And how do dice
mechanics work?
Dice mechanics.
Yes. This is not a D20 system. We'll just get that out of the way.
Throw your D20s away.
Well, no, don't throw them away. You'll still like them. You'll still use them. Not in this game, though. This game is called a variable dice mechanic, which means that every skill, every attribute is a specific die, mainly D4 to a D12. So D4, D6, D8, D12. Every skill, every attribute is one of those. You want to take it away?
Oh, sure. One of the key things is when the game has tiers of dice. So, whether it's skills, whether it's your attributes, they start as a D4, and then they go to a D6, and then they go to a D8. And so as you roll those, you're always focusing on a target number. And the traditional target or normal target number is 4. So you're going after a 4. 4 means success, and that is where you're going at. And now you'll say to yourself, well, what if I've only got a D4? It makes it pretty hard. But that's where this wonderful thing called exploding dice come in, where if you roll the top number on your dice, so a 4 on a D4, you roll it again and add it. So that's a pretty traditional acing exploding dice mechanic. And then that is kind of the key to that. And then anywhere you get past your target number by 4, it's called a raise. And so target number 4, get an 8, you've got a raise. You use a die from a D4 to a D12, and you're hitting that target number. Now that's pretty basic understanding there. We'll talk more about some kind of the details and how that goes, but that's the fundamentals, right? D4
Yes.
to D12. You roll it. You hit your target number of a 4, unless it's combat. We'll talk a little bit about that. And that's all it is. That's all it takes.
Yeah, so yeah, most things in the game are a 4 target number. There is a couple of other things that are not. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Most of the time for GMs, when something's difficult, you'll probably have like a flat negative modifier to it. Or the basic success won't give you that much. So it's obviously always up to the GM, but at least as me as a GM, I find when something's more difficult, I'll just give it like, oh, you have a -2, either because of circumstances or because of your background or something.
And actually, I don't want to throw too much editorializing on, but that's pretty traditional. That's when you're game mastering. If it's hard, it's -2. If it's kind of easy, it's +2. And you'll see as when we talk about a target number of 4, a +2 or a -2 is pretty significant.
Huge.
Yeah. So if you're used to like huge bonuses in other D20 games, you're not going to see them here, and they're not needed. So again, I'll get off my soapbox editorializing a little bit.
No, that was perfect. Yeah. And just once more to reiterate about raises is that it's, even if the target number wasn't 4, it's always 4 over the target number. So if your target number would just say it was 8, and you got a 12, then that would be a raise. So it's just 4 is the magic number for most of the target numbers, and 4 is always what a raise is going to be. That never changes.
Yeah, and
you could have multiple raises.
And we'll talk about what a raise is good for a little later.
Let's go right into Wildcards versus Extras. So going back again to this being a cinematic game, when you think about a movie, right? There's like the main characters. There's the main heroes and heroines and protagonists. There's also the main antagonist. There's the main villain. Those are all the wildcards. They are just meant to succeed more than all of the mooks, all of the extras. So everything else in the game. So all the player characters are wildcards. The main villain and probably some of his lieutenants will be wildcards. And then there'll be random NPC wildcards. But most everybody else is an extra. What's the difference between those two? Well, a wildcard, number 1, always gets to raise a d6 along with the die that he's rolling. So if you're rolling, let's say, stealth to sneak around, and you have a d4 in that, you roll a d4 plus you roll a d6, and then you take the better number that you rolled. So that wild die is with any time you roll an attribute or a skill, what's called a trait roll, you roll that wild die. The only time you don't roll it is with damage. What's the other thing that they're good for?
What wild cards are good for?
Yeah.
Well, wild cards, they have a fun thing called a Benny they can spend. And they also have the ability to take more than 1 wound. Did you mention that?
I did not mention wounds yet.
Well, that's good, because I was screwing around with my screen making sure everything's working right. So it's good you didn't say anything about wounds. So a wild card has what we call 3 wounds. And now, again, this is different than kind of a D&D where you have hit points and you kind of chop them down as you go. In Savage Worlds, you have 3 wounds. And if you get hurt, you take a wound, and you get 3 of them in the 4th one you're incapacitated. So it can be a deadly game.
Yes.
A wild card has 3 of those. An extra has, well, really none. As soon as an extra gets damaged, they're down out of the fight. So, when you're Indiana Jones and you're attacking a whole bunch of the mooks coming after you in the bazaar, you're just knocking them down one at a time. And for them to do something to you, they got to do something pretty spectacular.
Yes.
So that goes back to the cinematic and having a good time, just mowing down mooks.
And it mainly is the wild die though. And again, I just want to clarify that you roll your normal skill dice and the wild die, and you take the better. Now, they both can ace, so both your skill die can ace and your wild die can ace. And your wild die is always a d6. So even if you only have a d4 and a skill, you're still rolling that d6. You're still more likely to succeed if you just have like 1 point into a skill.
Yes, absolutely. And then, should we move on to, I alluded to it, one of my favorite things is Bennies.
Yes.
Bennies. So one of the things, what they call a meta currency. One of the things that Savage Worlds has is this idea of of a Benny, which allows you, if you have it, to do a number of things. You can re-roll a trait roll. You can recover from shaken. We'll talk about that in a minute, what shaken is. You can soak damage, so that even if you get a wound, you can use a Benny to say, hey, I want to try to soak that damage so I don't actually have that wound anymore. You can re-roll damage. You can regain points for your wizards and that sort of thing. And then one of my favorites is you can influence the story by spending a Benny and taking some of the narrative control. Savage Worlds is much more because of the way it's set up for narrative control and doing interesting things and trying different things through help mechanics and traits and support roles and all sorts of interesting things like that. It's not just I swing my stick and I hit them. So Bennies can be used for a lot of things. They give you an opportunity to kind of change what's going on and kind of take control of what's going on and re-roll if you want to and soak damage and do things like that.
You can also a couple things you missed there. You can also draw a new action card, which is what we use in initiative. So it can help you go sooner in initiative. We'll talk about initiative later. You can also re-roll damage, which is different from a trait roll. A trait roll is a skill or an attribute damage. You can also use a Benny to re-roll damage. As Carl said, mostly you'll be using Bennies to re-roll a trait roll. And you always start with 3 unless you have a hindrance, which is something that we'll go over later. But you always start with 3, and you mainly get them back by playing to your flaws, and that's we'll mainly talk about that more in the character creation video. But yeah, this is in this game. You're spending them, you're getting them. It's not like some of the other D20 games where you might get inspiration or you might get a hero point or whatever. You get those very rarely. This is, you want to be getting them a lot. You want to be spending them a lot. The GM also has them as well, and so do his wild cards. So you're not the only one re-rolling stuff.
That's right. GM can have a wild card too.
Yes.
We talked about extras, but GMs can have wild cards. So the big bad evil guy is going to end up being an extra, just like you are. And I think it's interesting to note that the idea of drawing an action card or re-rolling damage, that's new to the Adventure Edition, which this video is about. We're talking about Adventure Edition, but if you have a little bit of familiarity with the deluxe version, you'll see that that's brand new capabilities of a Benny, as well as influencing the story.
Yeah. That's it. I don't know. Bennies are great. Bennies are one of the main parts of this game. I mean, you can't. Savage Worlds is. It really does rely on that, and it kind of gives you more control. Just in the re-rolling part, it gives you more control on. I really want to do good at this. Like, this is something that I care about, and I want to do good with it. So. I found in-game most of the time it's not really used as much in combat. Sometimes it is, but this is used a lot out of combat, so that's why I really like them. I think we should move right along to combat since we brought up a couple of combat-related things.
Yeah, Bennies have a lot of good uses in combat. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about combat. But this every game, combat's important, so we definitely want to talk about combat.
Combat's important. Yeah, I think we should start with let's start with initiative real quick because we brought up initiative. So Savage Worlds originally, its kind of first setting was this Wild West setting. So that's why a lot of the terminology like raise, like they use poker as inspiration. So like raise and acing, all that stuff is kind of from that setting. But the way initiative works, when you begin combat, the GM will deal out every player and groups of extras or villain wild cards a card from like a normal 52 card playing deck. The higher number that you got, the sooner that you go in initiative. Now this is done every round, so there are rounds just like any other game, and this changes every single round. So every round you're being dealt a new card, and with the suits, like if somebody has a king and another person has a king, it's reverse suit order, so spades will go before diamonds. That's initiative, so it's pretty basic. Well, you want to talk about actions?
Well, so another most important part as far as combat goes is the actions you can do within a combat round. So now there's a concept of free actions and normal actions, and Free actions are things I can say something quick. I can quick draw a gun from a known location, from my holster. Those you don't have to pay for. Other
No.
actions pay for is not right. You can get if you do too many of them, you get some penalties to your rolls. So you can have up to 3 actions in a turn. And if you do more than 1 action in a turn, you get a -2 penalty. You do 3, you get a -4 penalty. But you still
To
can
all
do
your
3
actions.
To all your actions, but you still
Yes.
can do them. So you don't let that stop you. Some of the most fun is I'm going to throw my gun, draw my knife, stab them, and do all sorts of crazy stuff. And yes, you take a penalty to it, but it's great that you can do those 3 actions. You can also move in your turn, and that does
Completely
not count
free.
as one of your actions.
Yeah.
Yes, you can move up to your pace, which is what it's called in Savage Worlds. Now, if you run, that then adds a penalty to your other actions because that counts as an action.
But running is a free action. So running is a free action now in this edition. When you run, you roll usually a d6, but your run die might be higher or lower depending on things that you have or whatever. It is a free action, but yeah, it adds another -2 on all your actions. Now, going to what Carl was talking about with you have a maximum of 3 actions, but the way the multi-action penalties work in this game is that you have to say what you're going to do beforehand. So,
I forgot to say that. That's very
yeah,
important.
that's
You don't get to choose
extremely important. Now, that doesn't mean that you still have to do those things once you've started your turn, but because of those multi-action penalties apply to all of your actions, you have to say well, I'm going to go run over there, I'm going to shoot twice and then reload or something. Shooting is an action, reloading is an action. So you have to kind of say that beforehand because then that's the multi-action penalty that you have. Now, again, once you have said that, you're going to have those multi-action penalties no matter what, but you don't have to do all those actions. Things might change what's going on in the environment, so that might not happen. But you do have to state before you do anything how many actions you're going to do.
Yeah, because
that's extremely important.
People get a little confused about that, and they say, well, I can't, I did something, I shot my gun and I missed, well, I want to shoot again. Well, you have to declare them ahead of time because you'd get a -2 penalty on both of those actions. And so if you don't declare them beforehand, how do you know what the penalty is going to be? People get confused about that when they first start playing the game. They forget to say, all the actions they want to do and think that through a little more strategically. So do you want to talk a little bit about going and doing the attacks themselves?
Yeah, for sure. Attacking, usually there's 3 ways of attacking. There's melee attacking, there's shooting, which could be anything from a crossbow to any type of gun. And there's also, if you wanted to throw something like a grenade or a throwing knife, that actually uses your athletic skills. So there's fighting, which is a skill, shooting is a skill, and athletics. Melee combat. So melee combat is against somebody's parry.
Now, so this is different than that 4 target number. This is that's a stat.
This is not a fixed number. This is depending on whoever you're trying to attack's parry. Parry is, we'll talk about this more in the character creation, but very basically parry is calculated by half your fighting plus 2. So if you had a d6 in fighting, your parry would be a 5. So if I was trying to attack that person, if I hit a 5, that would be a hit. And then every 4 after that would be a raise. So hitting a 9 would be a hit with a raise. That's melee. Ranged. Now, ranged is that flat number. It's always trying to hit that 4. Because it's a gun, right? You don't really need to it's just accuracy on your end. But there's a lot of things that can give you negatives or positives. So if it's super long range, weapons will have range increments. So if it's super long range, you'll have a negative. If they have cover, there'll be a negative. If they have a certain edge, which is edges in this game, or with mini feats, that's what's all about it.
Lighting conditions, all sorts of things.
Yeah. There's all these different things that can affect. So you're trying to hit that 4, but there's probably be some negatives, modifiers on that. And athletics is throwing is the same thing. It's just like ranged combat. So you're trying to hit that 4, but a lot of things can affect it. When you hit, so a basic hit So when you hit, If it's just a normal hit, you roll your damage die. If you've gotten a raise, and you could have multiple raises, but at least one raise, you get your bonus damage die. Bonus damage is usually a d6, but there sometimes is ways to get more or less, but most of the time it's a d6. So you roll your damage die, you roll your bonus damage die if you have a raise, and this is kind of like the other rolls in the game. You're again trying to hit a target number based on a person's toughness. Toughness is a combination of like their natural toughness and any armor they're wearing. So toughness is calculated similar to parry, but it's half your vigor plus 2. So if you had a tough vigor of d6, it would be 3 plus 2 is 5. And to say you're wearing like a leather coat that had 1 armor, it would be add 1 to that, so it would be 6. So if I'm trying to, that person that I shot or hit, I'm trying to at least get 6 damage. And then again, there's raises in this as well. So it's the same kind of thing. I'm trying to hit that target number, which is their total toughness. And then I want to get raises. Now, in damage, raises are very, very important. And some weapons can also have armor piercing, which we'll talk about more in combat. But just know that you can get through armor, but not toughness. So
let's really summarize that. So
yeah.
In melee, the hit, I'm going against somebody's parry, which is a derived score from their fighting skill. Once I hit them, I try to do damage, and I only do damage if I get past their toughness, which is their armor plus, again, another attribute, and it's calculated. So now if range weapons, you just hit a 4 with all those negatives we talked about. So parry to hit, toughness to damage.
Yes. And what happens when you hit that target number? Well, there's two things in actually kind of 3 states, I guess, in Savage Worlds. So if you just hit that base target number, you do to them what's called shaken. Think of this like being shell shocked, or like you got winged in the shoulder and like it messed you up. And shaking can be from a lot of different things, but that. If you just hit their the basic number, so either that 4 or the tough. Oh, sorry, yeah, the toughness. They're just shaken. Shaken means that they can only move. They can't do any other actions. They can still do free actions, but no other actions. You recover from shaken on your turn. We'll probably talk about that in another episode, but basically shaken is the first one. Now any raise that you got, that's when you start getting wounds on people or yourself. So if the person had a toughness of 6 and I hit a 10, that would be shaken plus a wound. As we said before, wildcards can have up to 3 wounds. Extras can only take 1 before they're incapacitated, and wildcards can have 3, and then on the 4th they're incapacitated. Each wound that you have will give you a cumulative -1 to your pace, as well as -1 to all of your trait rolls. So anything that you try to do has that minus. So if you had 2 wounds and you tried to fight somebody, it would have a -2 to that.
Right. So you get a wound. There is a mechanical disadvantage for having a wound. So again, different than hit point type systems where I'm just as lethal at 1 hit point as I was at my full hit points. Wounds do affect you negatively. And now you get wounds and you don't want wounds, so we alluded a little bit before to soaking. Do you want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of soaking? Because this is really important for wildcards to be able to soak this damage, because Savage Worlds can be very deadly with the rolls and exploding dice.
Very deadly. And again, this is the other most important thing for Bennies. So Bennies, we talked about before, and one of them is re-rolling traits. This is the second or equal to the most important thing you can do with them.
Always save a Benny for soaking. So
always save a Benny for soaking. Yeah. So you spend a Benny and you roll a soak die. So a soak die is your vigor. This can be changed based on your edges again. Just think there's edges for everything. So, but you roll your vigor and you're trying to hit that target number 4 again. So if you hit a 4, you soak 1 wound. Every raise that you get over that, you soak an additional wound. When you soak all of your wounds, you're not even shaken. So quickly, so if you were about to take 2 wounds, so shaken plus 2 wounds, and you only soaked one of those wounds, you'd be left with 1 wound and you'd be shaken. But if you managed to soak both of them, you got an 8, then you would be nothing. You soaked all of your wounds and you're not shaken. This is kind of like that person had you dead to rights, was going to hit you super hard, and you just managed to like shove forward and tough it out and kind of get your shoulder in. You just managed to glance that blow off you. So you're soaking that damage. You're doing something that you're toughing it out. It didn't actually affect you. It should have, but it didn't. Fate kind of
and there's a lot, and there's constant, kind of in the community, there's a lot of talk about, when I got hit and damage was done to me and I soaked it, what does that really mean? But I think Eric hit it on the head. You really didn't get damaged. Something happened that you sort of, it just missed you, or you stepped into it as they were swinging. It would have done a lot of damage, but it didn't. So all of this stuff, from hitting to damage to soaking, is all happening at once. And so the outcome is determined at the end of that process. Whatever wounds are left, yep, I got hit and I got that wound from whatever machination was happening. So after 3 wounds, then comes incapacitation. But we're not going to spend a lot of time going into incapacitation, because there's rolls. You can die. You can, not die and have things happen to you and get permanent injuries. We won't get too much into that.
We'll talk about it in the combat
in
episode.
The combat section, that's probably the best when we do.
I wanted to state one thing where people get tripped up as far as soaking, is that you spend your Benny to soak, but like any other roll, this is a trait roll now, you can spend a Benny to re-roll it. What that means is that if I spent a Benny to soak and I didn't do anything at all, and I was like, God, I really want to soak these wounds, you'll spend a Benny again, then you re-roll that. So it's not like, in that example, say I spent a Benny to soak and I soaked 1 wound, but I still had 2 left, and then I spent another Benny to re-roll it, and I only soaked 1. Those don't add together. Whenever you spend a Benny to re-roll a trait die, you just re-roll everything altogether. And you take that, you can choose which results you want, but so they don't add together, but you can re-roll soak dies. And one thing we did forget to talk about is that whenever you roll 2 ones, so a 1 on your trait die and a 1 on your wild die, that is a critical failure. You've failed horribly, and you cannot spend bennies to re-roll that. Also, if you spent a Benny to re-roll it and you got that critical failure, you have to keep that critical failure. So most of the times when you spend bennies, you can choose which one you want to keep, but when you roll that critical failure, that you have to keep it. You tempted fate too much, and fate slapped you in the face. So,
but again, that has to be on both die, your wild die and the trait die, both of them. So it's, I don't know. Eric plays games in my games, and he had a weapon that would kill him if he got a
a 1
critical failure.
Just on my trait die.
Literally, he never seemed to ever get a critical failure. So it doesn't happen all the time. So maybe
it can though. Yeah. And they have changed it in this edition. So before we're not really going to touch much on powers, but they used to be your backlash would be from just rolling a 1. Now it's only a critical failure for backlash. So everything's a little bit easier. I guess real quick, so I just want to talk about healing just very quickly. Healing in this game, non-powered healing. There's a skill called healing, or healing, yeah. And it works the same way. You're trying to you roll healing on somebody, and every success and raise that you get, you take away a wound. But this can only be done within an hour. So we're not going to go back into that too much, but that's just the very basics of healing. There's also powers that can do healing on you.
Yeah, right. There's the healing powers just like you'd have in any other kind of fantasy or high-tech sci-fi, whatever game where there'd be those kind of powers.
Yes.
So now,
I think I was going to say, I'll pass it to you, but one of the things that's really important in this game is called test and support. We won't get into too much of, there's a ton of other combat options you can do. We'll talk about that in the combat deep dive, but test and support are very important to Savage Worlds, especially SWADE, specifically the Adventure Edition. Carl, why don't you inform us about those?
Well, this is a little editorial. This is some of the things that make Savage World really exciting, is that you can, even if you consider yourself combat ineffective, you can do a support role or do kind of a test against your opponents to help out your team. So support basically means I am I'm doing something to give a bonus to one of my friends. So, maybe we're driving high speed down the highway and there's somebody chasing us and, hey, if I tell you to quick change lanes here, I might give you a bonus on your driving skill. And so that's called a support. And so we would roll that just like any other trait roll, based on the skill that makes sense for it.
Yeah. And you can definitely petition the GM, work with the GM. Both supports and tests, I just want to kind of throw in real quickly, is that they're very open narratively. It really rewards
That's
creativity.
the important part, yep.
As his example, that cool like driving down the road, that person probably like, can I use notice to kind of spot it out? Or, somebody could even stretch it and be like, there's some like weird, I see some like weird rock formations, like maybe use science, like geology, like that's possible. Like make the case to your GM. Like, so it's all of this is very open narratively. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in.
And this is why I think we included the concept of tests. Now, test is against an opponent. Like I'm trying
Yes.
to, I'm going to, that ogre running at me, I'm going to kick sand in his face and, dive to the side, and that'll give that person a penalty so that the rest of them, so it makes it harder for him to attack my friends. I didn't actually attack him. I didn't hit him with a sword. I didn't actually do any damage. It was all narrative, all cinematic that I did to kind of change and support my team or hinder my foes. You jumped in, but it was absolutely important. This is part of what makes Savage Worlds really cool, that you can do these sorts of things. I can be the glasses wearing science guy who can't do who couldn't point a gun the right direction, and in combat he can say, hey, I'm going to use my science knowledge to recognize that if you shoot that light bulb on the ceiling, that glass is going to fall on top of him, and so I'm going to try to get them blah 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 blah, and then work with the game master on how that might affect the game.
So very basically, yeah. So tests are always against an opponent, and support is always helping your allies out. So let's talk about tests more specifically, because I think we should get into it even for the basics video, because it's kind of important to understand what they do. So there's a lot of stuff we're not going to touch on, but tests are very open. They can, so you basically decide, okay, what kind of skill do I want to use to do a test on an opponent? Every skill is open. When you do that skill, you roll your skill die, and then the target number, this is what's called an opposed roll. There's not really a target number. You're just trying to beat
opposed rolls, so this is a good time to do that.
So opposed rolls versus target numbers, where a lot of games have this, but an opposed roll is you're rolling something, the opponent's rolling something, and you're trying to get if you're the one doing it, you're trying to meet their number or, get raises again. So there's raises. How it works in SWADE. So if we're talking about, if you've played Savage Worlds in older edition, how it works in SWADE is that the person who's attacking, the person who's doing the test, always rolls first, can then decide to use Bennies if they want, and then the defender gets to go. So you can't see what the defender rolled and then, I want to use a Benny. Once you've kind of locked it in, you've done it. So that's a pose roll. So with a test is you decide on a skill. So like we've talked about science. Now you could even use fighting. You can even use shooting. You can say fighting is kind of like a feint, right? You can be like, I want to feint. I want to do a test on this person. I want to feint. So it's whatever, again, narratively you want to do. You decide on the skill. The opponent defends with that linked attribute. So we'll get into this more with character creation, but fighting is linked to agility, so which is an attribute. So if you're using fighting, then they're going to use agility to defend. If you succeed on that, there's two kind of main conditions in Savage Worlds. So there's not a ton of conditions. There's two main ones. There's what we have, what's called vulnerable, which means that when you're vulnerable, everybody has +2 against you. So no matter what it is, if somebody's trying to do something to you, they have +2. If you're distracted, you have -2 on whatever you're rolling. So distracted's -2 for you, and vulnerable is people have +2 against you. So when you successfully test a foe, you decide, I want to make them vulnerable or I want to make them distracted. One thing to note with tests is that you can't really repeat it too much. As a GM, they definitely say to, if somebody's keeps feigning over and over again or keeps insulting somebody over and over again, that's not going to work over and over again.
Yeah, because it won't work on a normal person over and over again.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And then support is you're just trying to roll a basic success, and then you add a +1 to their rolls. So, like in that case with the driving, is I'm rolling notice. If I get that 4, I'd give a +1 to their driving. If I got an 8, which is a raise, I'd give a +2. So that's the basics of those. Anything you want to say about those?
I think again, this is different than previous editions where it was much more limited. Now it's really only limited to your imagination as a player. And I mostly game master, and so I get really excited when players, think of something creative to do to help their team out or to hinder an opponent that goes beyond I walked up and I hit him with a stick.
Yeah.
So so if you're a player and you're learning this game, this is no tests and supports. They're really going to be useful. Don't think, I always have to attack somebody or I always have to swing my sword or do something. There's so many more options you can do this. Actually support your friends or hinder a very powerful foe, and that sometimes is very, very important. When you're going against a strong opponent, stacking these bonuses and these are going to be really important to help people get past their toughness or get past their parry by adding these penalties and helping and supporting your fellow adventurers.
And you made a good point. Is that I'm a big player, but I've also GM a game, and I've definitely found that people don't think about it as much to do that. I think it's just so much easier to if you have just combat or you have powers, but these are something that are available to everybody at all times. And I've definitely seen in cases it really makes the difference. You're not hitting somebody, they have a crazy parry, do something to distract them to either make it easier for you or somebody else. So yeah, they're extremely important. I think next, this will pretty much be it. I think we should just touch on powers very quickly.
Very little, because power is complicated. You really need to deep dive into that. So just touch on powers a little bit.
So very basically, powers are they're called arcane backgrounds. There's 4 main ones of them that just come standard with core: magic, miracles, gifted, and weird science. So crazy inventions. They're pretty much blank templates that you can kind of put your own into, either as a player or as the GM or the setting, whatever it is. You don't have to take them when you start, but it usually makes sense to. Those have a specific skill to each of them that they're only kind of available once you have that. What's very kind of confusing about it, why I wanted to bring it up now, is that so we'll take magic, for example. Magic has spellcasting is a skill. You have to have just because you take the magic background, which is an edge that you would take, doesn't mean you have any ranks in that skill. So you still have to kind of take that skill. So they each have their own starting skill, and you depending on the magic background, you'll get a certain amount of powers. Now, all the powers in the game, again, this is a game there's no inherent genre, so they're all kind of these kind of stripped down powers, and then you add your own trapping to it. So Savage Worlds, one thing we didn't really talk about is it's all about trappings. Most of your character stuff, most things in this game they want to leave it as kind of universal as possible, and then you add your own spin, you add your own flavor. So a power like Bolt, right, which is just like an energy bolt, can be anything from, it's just called Bolt, but it can be anything from a fire bolt, an ice bolt, to a bunch of insects. The trappings are there, and there's not really any written down mechanical benefits, but narratively things will make sense. So if somebody's covered in gasoline and you have a flame bolt, that will do extra damage to them. If that person's covered in ice, it'll do less damage. So, again, I don't want to talk too much about it, but I just wanted to kind of touch on that. There's so much more to talk about, but I'll leave it at that, that it's in an edge and there's skills linked to them.
Yeah, so you have to take it. So that's important. You have to take an edge to get there, and then there's skills that define, again, being able to get past the target number for success to cast your power. And this is a system that's based on power points for the most part. You're spending points to do things versus spell slots, which you may have obviously seen in other games.
Yeah.
So it's different from maybe some other games where they don't use power points, but that's what Savage Worlds uses. There is a setting thing that allows you not to use them, but we won't get into that. That's probably something.
Yeah, we'll save that. Yeah, we should definitely save that. I think that's good, man. I think that should give most people the very basics to kind of maybe not completely get up and play right away, but definitely to kind of understand the basics and what we're talking about in later videos. Our next video will be a very in-depth character creation. This will be a big boy episode, probably longer than any of the other episodes. We're really going to go into how to make a character and what it all means and our opinions and everything. So we'll definitely be referencing this video. Anything you want to say more?
Well, I was going to say just that this is, the book is hundreds of pages, and so we did our best to sort of give you a feel for some of the key concepts. And so now when you start playing, you'll understand some of the terminology, some of the verbiage. Some things will make sense without having to be explained in depth, and so that'll help you get up to speed quickly. And then the other thing is we'll do some as we go forward. We might get into settings, but that's another item that will change the game a little bit for you. Settings add their own rules, their own edges, hindrances, that sort of thing. And so the core book really defines how to play the game, but then there will be things like setting books that'll add to that excitement by adding particulars to the genre that they put forward. But no, I think that's the key thing. We talked about dice mechanics, talked about how cool bennies are, combat, my favorite tests and support. So I think we really hit the highlights there. So
yeah.
I appreciate everybody's time. Hopefully this was useful to you. We're just starting out, so sound quality, video quality, all qualities, you got to cut us some slack. But I appreciate, again, my co-host Eric, whose knowledge of the rules surpasses my own. So
well, not necessarily, but
at least maybe articulates it better. I don't know. Either way, so
I would say I come from more of a player background. Carl comes from more of a GM background. Although I play in his game and he plays in my game. So
so we know how to sort of talk from both sides of the fence, and that's great. So and you'll see that as we do more videos. So again, I appreciate the time that you invested in this video. We're at about 40 minutes, and so I think this really does a good job of explaining it, and look forward to future videos.
Yeah.
Thank you much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.